So now we have almost an hour for discussion, both referring to your specific paper, but also to those who were postponed, namely Vincenzo Bassi and Marcelo and the other ones. So please, Carotta, oh, everybody. Sorry? Yes, yes. Now Marcelo is first because he asked before the break, okay?
Very nice paper. And very interesting this reflection that you put about religion and family in a working class especially, but not only. But what are the main reasons of this change in these last 40 years that you say? For example, many times the Pope say that we have an ideological colonialism, the Pope say, that in the end is made by the media and by the newspapers and also in the schools that think that the human being could be safe human being and not need religion. Religion is something of the past. It's a medieval question. Religion is nothing. Today we have science, we have other kind of rationality, other kind of life. So what is the reason? This could be a reason. What is the real reason, this change in these last 40 years that you say?
Very much, Chancellor, for that question. It's an important one. And I've tried to make clear that I think a fundamental values change, which has affected religion, but is not limited to religion. This movement from a, not collectivist, but a communitarian view about our obligations to other people, to a very individualistic focus, that's visible in our religious lives, but it's also visible in all other aspects of our lives. So I don't think it's just religion. And I think that the decline of traditional religion, or the decline of religion in America, is, I've indicated, an important part of this problem, but I don't think it's actually the only problem. I think that if you ask where did this unexpected, and I do argue in a different book, and it's not part of it, a book that I've recently published called The Upswing, which I'm not going to try to summarize here, but in that book I've tried to argue that it's a massive change. America over the last 125 years began in a period of great individualism, moved in the middle of the 20th century toward a period of more worrying about other people and more communal sentiment and more equality and less political polarization and so on. But over the last, basically the last 50 years, there's been this, in every sphere of American life, increasing emphasis on individualism. And I don't have a good explanation because it's so overwhelming, it covers so much of American society that it's hard to find a single answer for such a big change. Part of it may be technology, but I don't think that's most of it. Part of it clearly is economics and the growing economic inequality, although I have to say, and that's what I thought was the main story, frankly, growing economics, and I still think that's an important part of the story. But if you do a detailed analysis in this other book, I mean, that we did for this other book, economic change is a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator. That is, economic inequality, it's not that economic inequality is very bad, very, very bad. But in terms of change over time, the leading indicator was actually not economic inequality. The leading indicator was morality. And I was, as a social scientist, frankly, shocked to find that measures of morality, that is, measures of the degree to which Americans have focused on either themselves or the broader part of America. This was captured in the church. I'm sorry, I'm going to be bad now here, but the reforms of Leo the 23rd. What was the social Catholic? Pardon? Leo the 13th. Yes, that's the face in the Catholic Church of this same movement at the end of the 19th century. But there was a similar move across all the religions, across Protestant religions, across Judaism, and across secular society in America. I'm conscious, Chancellor, that I'm evading your question because I don't have a very good answer, but I don't think it's simply things that have happened in and around the church over the last. I think the church can help here, and I've tried to indicate why I think that, but I don't think this is mainly a problem caused by the church, nor mainly a problem that can be fixed by the church doctrinally. It requires the church's action. I mean, the fundamental problem is, how are we going to reach these poor kids? And that requires not just, I'm sure that does require doctrinal change. Is this making sense? I'm sure it requires doctrinal change, but it also requires action. I think the language in these circumstances is pastoral. I would put is that right? I mean, I'd put much more of the emphasis on the pastoral role of the church in fixing this problem. I don't know if that makes sense or not. I'm trying to speak Catholic, but I'm not really a Catholic.
Professeur Dumont, la question que je voudrais poser regarde principalement les chiffres que vous avez, et je ne sais pas si vous avez ces chiffres, qui concernent la natalité entre les familles qui sont parties du groupe des réseaux de familles. Parce que ce que j'ai vu, selon mon expérience, que quand on vit dans une communauté de familles, il est plus facile d'être encouragé d'avoir et de générer des enfants. Et la deuxième question regarde les politiques familiales, parce que c'est vrai qu'en Europe, on va toujours à demander des politiques actives. Mais maintenant, si on regarde l'Italie, on voit qu'il y a des obstacles à faire famille. Et pour ça que quand on parle de politique familiale, pour moi, il serait suffisant que l'État ne fait rien. Parce que quelquefois, comme aujourd'hui, il est difficile à faire famille parce qu'il y a des obstacles aux couples qui voudraient avoir des enfants. Et après, il faut préciser toutes les fois, ça c'est mon opinion, il faut toujours préciser que ça, on parle des désirs d'avoir un enfant. Parce que c'est vrai que dans le passé, comme disait le père Schalberg, il disait qu'on a toujours des mémoires des politiques natalistes en Italie de Mussolini ou de Hitler. C'est vrai ça, mais ça a été l'intérêt de l'État. Maintenant, on parle de l'intérêt des familles. C'est quelque chose de différent. L'État doit seulement reconnaître la responsabilité des familles à participer au bien commun. Merci.
Merci de vos deux questions. Donc la première question concerne l'évolution.
Notre expérience, parce que je suis le président, comme vous savez, de la Fédération des associations familiales en Europe, et que la natalité est plus haut dans le réseau des familles. Quand la solitude est la maladie la plus mauvaise. Ce n'est pas parce que pour être encouragé à avoir un enfant, il faut avoir, comme vous disiez, le village, mais maintenant on n'a pas les villages, parce qu'on n'existe pas les villages, mais on peut rattraper la qualité des relations qu'on avait dans le village à travers les réseaux de famille.
Oui, donc votre première question porte sur les causes en fait de la fécondité. Par nature, la fécondité est un phénomène plurifactoriel, donc qui est lié à des contextes culturels, à un contexte économique, aux politiques qui sont mises en place. Et donc, il est vrai que dans l'aspect du contexte culturel, l'existence de réseaux de famille est un élément qui peut favoriser le libre choix d'enfants, surtout si ces réseaux de famille permettent effectivement à ceux qui souhaitent des enfants de les aider dans leur projet d'enfant. Donc, bien entendu, quand je parle de politique familiale, il ne faut pas songer qu'à la politique familiale mise en place au niveau de l'État, et par exemple de l'État italien. Donc une politique familiale sur un territoire quelconque de l'Italie, comme Milan par exemple, ça veut dire que dans les décisions prises par l'État italien, par la région Lombardie, par la ville de Milan, par les associations de réseau des familles, il y ait des éléments qui favorisent la vie des familles. Donc c'est tout cet ensemble qui permet d'avoir une politique familiale dynamique. Mais à supposer, par exemple, qu'il y ait de bonnes décisions de politique familiale prises par le Parlement italien, mais que la ville de Milan ait une attitude malthusienne vis-à-vis des familles, ça va entraîner forcément des difficultés. Mais ces réseaux de familles, ils doivent être aussi encouragés par ces politiques, parce qu'ils n'existent pas comme ça par hasard. Alors, sur votre seconde question, bien que j'ai commencé à la traiter, pourquoi a-t-on besoin d'une politique familiale? Tout simplement en raison de la logique des générations. C'est-à-dire que dans le cycle de vie des personnes, ils sont d'abord enfants, puis adolescents, puis éventuellement ils se mettent en couple, et il arrive une période, s'ils ont des enfants, où cela représente des coûts d'éducation inévitables. Et puis ensuite, les enfants s'en vont et ils ont une autre période de leur vie où ils n'ont plus de charge d'enfants. Donc la politique familiale, il s'agit d'assurer la solidarité entre les générations, donc que des générations qui, à un moment donné, n'ont pas de coûts d'éducation, viennent à l'aide de ceux qui, à cette période donnée, ont des coûts d'éducation. Et puis ensuite, ce sont les autres qui aideront les autres. Donc c'est un problème de solidarité dans le temps entre les générations. C'est pour ça que penser qu'un pays devrait ne pas avoir de politique familiale, c'est absurde, parce que c'est ne pas considérer la nécessité de la solidarité entre les générations et du passage de relais que j'ai évoqué dans mon texte, mais que je n'ai pas pu rappeler tout à l'heure.
Rocco Bottiglione.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Professor Putnam. I thought this was fascinating and extremely helpful. Two quick comments and then the real question. The first comment, I'm very grateful that you made the passing remark for us Americans not to reduce it to race, which we're always so tempted to do, and which misses, I agree, then misses the much bigger picture. And well, let's go to the question, which follows along similar lines to those of the Chancellor. I was musing about what might be the causal mechanisms behind this growing gap. And as a more narrow way of framing the question, not merely as economics, most broadly speaking in terms of economic inequality, income inequality, and so forth, I wonder what you might speculate based on what you've studied regarding the connection between the changing nature of labor specifically and the labor market and employment over these things. Whether the relative decline in the stability of labor, in particular for the working classes, might be part of what's going on. And one of the reasons that leads me to speculate about that is I find it very interesting that you're, and I gather other social scientists studying the same phenomenon, so consistently rely on college education as the proxy for dividing these classes. Not income levels, as I understand it, but college education. Why? Is it the same thing? Okay. So I'm curious what the connection might be then between where college education and whether that is connected, in fact, to the nature of the labor market, because then one presumes that college-educated kids have access to more stable employment opportunities, so there's less disruption, there's less inconsistency, more certainty and stability in that. The final observation and a comment, again, is this seems to me to be so illuminating also of larger political trends in terms of the rise of populism and the decline in sort of confidence in institutionality and authority. And so the implications of what you say have really very massive consequences for us.
Thanks very much, Paolo, if I may. I understand the questions. First of all, on the methodology issue of using college education, it's true that over the last 70 or 80 years, but especially over the last 40 or 50 years, college education has itself become a stronger predictor of income. That's true. But for that reason, college education now, if you run all of my graphs using some measure of income, the graphs look identical. So there's no difference. You wouldn't reach I'm quite confident of that because I've spent a lot of time on that issue. You would reach nothing I told you would have been any different if I had kept using, and indeed when I'm speaking loosely to public audiences, I talk about rich kids and poor kids. But by what I mean by rich kids and poor kids, because it is the same thing, is kids from college-educated backgrounds versus kids from working class or non-college educated backgrounds. The changing nature of labor is a really interesting question, but as in this whole area, because everything's happening at the same time, it's very hard to tell which came first. And the technical term for economists here, the technical term is multicollinearity. I'm going to now try to explain multicollinearity in ordinary language. If you're looking at a flock of seagulls at the shore, and they're flying this way, and then they turn, and they all fly back that way, and then they turn again, they all fly back that way. Even if you look extremely carefully, because their turns are simultaneous, you can't tell which the leader is. There's just no way you can, because there's so, and sometimes in social science, the changes, the relationships among different variables, that is the patterns of change, are so instantaneous that you just can't tell. You can't use the thing we normally we use the trick for trying to determine causality of asking, well, which came first? Because if it came second, it can't be the cause. Causes come before their change. But this whole area is rife with, and now I speak to the economists, multilinearity. If I speak to ordinary people, I say it's rife with seagulls turning. You just can't tell. And that's not a mistake on my part. It's just that's the way the world is. That said, if I had to guess, I'd guess that the changing structure of the changing instability in working class, you're certainly right that there's been a change in the stability of working class jobs. But that's not an exogenous cause. That's not something that God said we're going to have a different kind of, I mean, maybe he did, I don't know, but I'm not an inspector. But it isn't something from outside the system. That's in part because of the weakness of labor unions. But weakness of the labor unions is part of this same story. But if you ask, well, where did that come? We're back in the realm of these seagulls. That is, the power of the labor unions changed at the same time that the power of all these other things changed. I'm ducking your question, but I'm trying to explain why I'm not just ducking your question. Now, and I'm conscious I don't want to go any longer, except I have to say something about political change, because it's highly relevant here. And this, there are many, many things to be said about politics. The changes that I'm talking about, I've been talking about changes in America over the last 50 years as they apply to the family and as they apply to norms, cultural norms, and as they apply to kids. And all of those changes began 50 years ago. And if you draw a graph, Trump comes into that story, and populism comes into that story very late, very, very late. These changes, the changes I'm talking about in the family structure and so on, begin, roughly speaking, in 1965, and they're mostly finished by 1970 or 75. It's all there, and the trends that I'm talking about are, if you look at my graph, they're all steadily downward since, and you can't see any effect of Obama or of Hillary or of Trump. I'm a strong anti-Trump person, but this is not something I can blame on Trump. You see what I'm trying to say? It's much deeper than that. Trump is, I don't mean to be just personalizing, populism of left or right is a response to these changes. And remember, I think the changes are fundamentally driven by morals. So, you know, if you ask me, well, what's Mike to do? I want to get on I would like to get on a preacher's stand and preach to people and say, look, we have to care for other people. Read the Sermon on the Mount, for goodness sakes. Sorry, I'm way out of sight of my...
Thank you. Professor Putnam, I wish you to go on what you were saying, because I think the next chapter is, why comes that? Why comes that people who do not live according to family values massively vote for a party that pretends to defend family values, and people who live more or less according to family values massively vote for a party that is for, let us say, the sexual revolution of our times? Because from what you say, it seems that the upper class should vote for the Republicans, and the working class should vote for the Democrats. But this is not the case. Am I mistaken?
The last point is factually correct, and I make this point in the paper, but I did not emphasize it because I knew this would be the most controversial thing I would say in this context. I've said that there were clear cultural changes, which you could, if you wanted to, describe as family values that have changed, that are relevant. But that's not in the sense that family values is used in politics in America. The ideological predictors, the ideological characteristics that are now associated with family values, the particular values that people have about, I don't know, homosexuality or you know, pick any of the issues that we're fighting about now. None of those predict. The stronger you claim that you're against homosexuality, the data show that is, if anything, positively correlated with real family values. If I can, and I know I'm speaking against many views here, but it's the places, you can see it this way, the places in America where this problem of fragmented, fragile families is the greatest are exactly the places where Trump and the Republicans have done best, not worse. The places in America, the blue places, I'm not trying to defend blue, I'm just saying empirically, the blue places and blue people in America are the ones who are actually acting in defense of family values in the broader sense that I'm using that. I would rest my case empirically on that being true. Now, what we make of that is I'm not sure. I'm not.
Thank you very much, Rob, if I may. You pointed out those huge increases in socioeconomic differences and in socio-cultural differences as well. We may add, of course, that there are increasing differences where those people live, spatial differences, and all of this amounts to a decrease of mobility, obviously. So people are getting stuck, left behind places, and this is a vicious circle. Now, at the end of your last answer, you said you would like to preach on a bridge. But my question indeed is, where are you seeing ways out of this? Where do you see that social cohesion can be recreated? Where are places to meet? And do you think the churches are such places which can bring people together so that they meet, that they talk, that they decrease their biases and stereotypes, which they obviously have, and that this, of course, also then helps democracy to survive?
Yes, I completely agree with your framing of the issue. I completely agree with that. And in my remarks here, I omitted to talk about growing segregation in American society and the growing segregation in class terms. I'm not talking about racial terms. There's high racial segregation in America. That's been true for a long time, but there's high class segregation in America, and that hasn't been true for a long time, and that is another factor here, and it's discussed in the paper, but I didn't say in my remarks, so I agree with that. But no.
What are the ways to overcome the present situation?
I was about to try to answer that question. I'm sorry, should I answer that question? I want to answer that question. I'll try to be quick. The question is, how can we bridge the cleavages that are so strong in American society today, and maybe in other societies too? And my jargon for that is, how can we create bridging social capital? That is, connections that cross political and ideological and cultural and economic lines. And I don't know, if I knew for sure the answer to that question, I'd run for president. But here's what I've been telling our current president about that. It means beginning with young people. You have to begin with young people because they're the future. And therefore, we need to begin focusing on how to bring kids from blue states and red states together, kids from Catholic backgrounds and from Protestant backgrounds and from secular backgrounds together. Not to talk about religion, but to talk about sports or to talk about what most kids talk about. That is, we need to bring them together in ways in which they see one another not as representatives of the other, but they see one another as fellow human beings with the same foibles and the same interests and the same. Now, there are institutions that are doing that now in America. Churches could be a hugely important thing, but churches have to want to do that. And to the extent that churches focus, I'm sorry, now you invited me to say this, to the extent that churches focus on getting their kids to see the world exactly the way the church sees the world, that's not going to make them more open to people who see the world in different ways. And therefore, this requires a certain kind of ecumenicism, including, I'm sorry to say, ecumenicism that involves people who are nominally secular. But that's not historically unusual. There have been lots of examples in American history of groups that have brought young Catholics and young Protestants and young nothings together. And is that responsive to your question?
I wouldn't dare. Thank you so much. I so much enjoyed, especially your endeavors to articulate an inner Catholic voice in conveying your findings today. Like Paolo, I commend you. We all understood two Americas, separate and unequal. And the dominant frame historically was the race frame. And I think you contribute a great deal to delving into the internal dystopia that now has come to characterize much broader sectors of our American society. Of course, you know this very well. A new generation of basic research in cognitive neuroscience, it begins to articulate the cartography of the savage inequalities that begin in utero and in the first 1,000 days of life. Just very basic, primitive glutochroniometric studies. How many words children hear predict extraordinary subsequent differences if by the 4th grade you can't read, which is an endemic problem now in our schools. This becomes the best predictor of incarceration, for example, mass incarceration. So 2 or 3 observations. First, and I think this may also connect some of the reflections of our earlier colleague. I think it's extremely important in understanding the human condition, world ethnography, that these formations are outliers. Most people in the world do not live in the world of the secular religion of the triumph of individualism, what you might call, I think if I understood you correctly, second generation individualism. Not the individualism of de Tocqueville, but this dystopic individualism that announces so much of the fundamental coming apart of the basic fabric. So, as the universal church, I think it's extremely important that we locate the problems in the United States, the problems in Italy, the problems in Europe, in a much broader context of world ethnography. Most people do not live in the phenomenology of experience or in their social practices in the church of secular, radical, dystopic individualism. This is an outlier, and it's very recent and ethnographically very rare. So I guess, I'd like your comments on the following matter. So I'm intrigued here, because if we look at the two geologic shocks to the American system recently, the opiate epidemic and all the despair, what economists have called the deaths of despair. So that really aligns with your story that the dystopia lives in complicated ways within what we think in terms of the white Euro-American tradition. Now, COVID, the second geologic shock to the system, tells a slightly different story, which is, again, a deeply racialized story. If we understand who got COVID, if we understand who got hospitalized by getting COVID, if we understand who died by COVID, it's deeply racial. Racial differences predict that journey better than maybe any other indicator.
Thank you for those comments, and I agree with much of what you said. Let me just say two things. Yes, you're right that the people who have embraced fully this second-generation individualism are outliers. They just happen to be the most powerful people in the world in general, and therefore I think it's worth paying attention to the characteristics that they have. Secondly, I think, let me say what I have said to many secular audiences in America. First of all, I'm not Catholic. I'm not even Christian. I'm a converted Jew. But I've said to many secular audiences in America that the strongest voice for reversing excessive individualism in America is the current Pope. I think he is a godsend, and I'm using that intentionally, for the rest of the world. And his core message is exactly right. We have obligations to other people. I don't agree with every aspect of Catholic theology, goodness knows, but on that central point, this Pope is terrific. And I'm saying, and I don't say that because I'm in his home. I say that because it's true. Last point I want to make about COVID, if I can quickly. It's true that race is an important predictor. But the best predictor of who has died and where people have died and where people have not died in America and in the world is the degree to which, in my jargon, they are and they're living in a we society rather than an I society. And in saying that, I mean in places where people, long before COVID happened, where we had measured the degree to which people were other-directed, we-directed, or I-directed. It's true of regions of Italy, which I know well, but it's also true of counties in the United States. Those places with a powerful moral sense of obligations to other people, as measured decades earlier, fewer people died there, fewer people were hospitalized there. A we orientation turned out to be even more, I've got to be careful here, as important as vaccines in protecting people. And that's not accidental. It's because when I put that on, I'm basically protecting you. Wearing a mask or getting a vaccination is important not because it protects you, but because it protects other people. But if you don't care about other people, then you don't wear your mask and you don't get your jab. And it is also about race. I agree with that entirely, Marcelo. But it's also, what we're talking about here is provably a matter of life and death.
Great, thank you. Great, thank you. That was a very wonderful paper and presentation. I wanted to comment on underlying causes a little bit. And I think there's a lot that we can learn also by putting the U.S. in a broader perspective, because certain things are similar in Europe, other things are different, and we can learn a lot. The most powerful economic shaper of the last century is the rise of the knowledge economy. So the underlying dynamics of technology have reshaped economies. And one of the fundamental things that technology has done is substituted for basic labor in industry and in goods producing sectors, and has been complementary to education-based skills, what economists call capital skill complementarity. This is really a fundamental point. It means that there has been a rising demand for higher levels of education. That shows up in the market premium. And not only is there a larger premium to education, even when there's more education, so more supply, the premium remains strong or even rising. So children who don't get a college education in the United States fall behind. This is a fundamental point. It's true everywhere. Then there is the question of compensatory public policy to that. That could include funding education. Instead, in the United States, working class kids are turned to student debt, ending up with a generation of more than $1 trillion of debt. So this is, I think, a core underlying driver of the rising inequality. Then the public policy determines how much that inequality shows up in different life trajectories or not. In the United States, we've not had compensatory social policy, as you say, for more than 40 years. That raises questions of values in politics. Why was there not compensatory response to this underlying technological force? Because the technological change applied to Sweden or Germany or other countries too, the outcomes have been in a similar direction, but a vastly different magnitude. The opening of inequality in the United States has been hugely greater. I would suggest 3 factors, maybe I'd say 4 factors actually. First, the US has always been less socially oriented. You start with the end of the 19th century, and you said that, and then it changed. But I think the big values changes came with the Depression and World War II and its aftermath. The progressive era had a little bit. It reverted early in the 1920s. To my mind, Roosevelt's revolution lasted about 40 years. It had a profound effect on American ideas about we, as you said, but it ended up dissipating, I'd say, back to an American normal in a way, rather than the opposite. So now, why did the New Deal era, which is a period of Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, why did it end? And there I would say race is a fundamental issue. Race blew apart the political consensus in the 1960s, and the United States never recovered it. And I believe that Reagan till Trump has a deep underlying racist core to it. This is to be elaborated, but I think it is a deeply racist core, and it reverts back to a lot of deep American traditions. It meant that we could not sustain a social attitude. Of course, there are other factors that are very particular to the U.S. I'd say the last point that's special to the U.S. is the rise of the U.S. empire after World War II. I think it's the most pernicious single factor in American politics. Basically, we became a society driven by the CIA more than anything else, probably including a coup against President Kennedy in 1963. And one of the notable facts of the US is the complete collapse of trust in government started in the 60s. It actually started with the assassination of Kennedy. And from then on, and I think for a reason that we lived through a coup that was never explained, never unfolded, never told, led by the CIA, in my opinion. But in any event, I think it's part of the deep unraveling of American society. So we ended the 60s in a chaos, and we've never gotten back to any kind of social consensus since then, and the polarization has profoundly deepened from that point. So my point, to summarize, is the underlying pull of those two graphs, which you show brilliantly, that's a deep economic trend. Jobs just don't exist in the real goods sector, in what we call the goods producing sector. It's 12% of the labor force now. It used to be 40%, 50%, 60%. If you want to have a decent life, you better get a college education in the United States. But if you're a working class kid, you will not. With a very high probability, you will not end up with a college education. And that means we have two societies that are behaving as you showed so brilliantly.
Jeff and I are very old friends. Therefore, I can take advantage of that fact to disagree. But I'll try to do so quickly and intelligently. First of all, I agree about the education factor. But of course, that education factor education has been important, not just in this recent period. A secondary education, high school education, was crucially important in the first half of the 20th century. And then America was the leader in the creation of mass secondary education because of a policy decision. And therefore, that you agreed with that. Basically, all of these economic things could have been adapted to, either overcome by investing in education or by compensatory social policies. So we agree about that. The question is explaining politics. And Jeff is an economist, and I'm a political scientist by origin. I'm not saying, therefore, I'm right in explaining politics, but I am saying I have a different political analysis than Jeff does, which is embodied in this book that I've referred to, The Upswing, which is I'm not trying to sell books here, but if you're taken by Jeff's account, then you ought to read The Upswing, because The Upswing offers an entirely different interpretation of what happened during the 20th century. The Upswing says it's not mostly about the New Deal, and it's not mostly about the World War I. Those are important factors. It's mostly not about that, and it is a lot about race. I agree entirely about that. I don't think it's mostly about the Kennedy assassination, actually. There are many, many things that happened, and I don't rank even though the Kennedy assassination, I remember the Kennedy assassination, and you don't, Jeff. So I'm not going to try to resolve that. It's a perfectly legitimate disagreement among political analysts, some of which are economists by training, some of which are political scientists by training. You've heard Jeff's very strong account. and if you want to hear a different account of American political history in the 20th century, that's what we're disagreeing about, read The Upswing.
Yeah, thank you, Robert, for the talk. I learned a lot reading your paper. My commentary is a very a collateral one, because the statistics that you show are very clear. And but I was wondering that some wealthy parents spoil their children, and some poor parents educate them well. So the key is the not so much the money, but the use they make of money. And that's culture. Perhaps that's the reason why the focus on college education and also in the religious education is so important, because in this way you get a priority, a sense of what's more important for your kids and that kind of thing. No? So yes, I like to stress this aspect, because otherwise it could seem that everything is just a matter of the economics, and that's not the case. Behind your explanation, in fact, there is this cultural dimension deeply embedded in the proxies that you choose to analyze the whole problem.
Thank you for that correction. All I'd add is I showed a growing gap in investing money in kids, but I also showed a growing gap in investing time in kids. And we should not assume that poor people, though they don't have very much money, have lots of time to invest in their kids. They are also suffering from a shortage of time, because they're mostly single-parent families, and they're mostly trying to do a million other things. Economics has constrained their use of time. So it's not they don't love their children, but they're not as effective in family dinners and in even hugs. It sounds like crazy. How much time could the hug take? But if you're basically, I once had the opportunity to speak with the First Lady of the United States, George W. Bush's wife. I'm blanking on her name. Huh? Not Barbara. Laura Bush, yes. I was briefing them in the White House, and she agreed with me and said, George, think about it. If you don't know when we're going to be able to keep your house because of the mortgage, and you don't know whether you're going to have a job, you just have less time and energy for investing in the kids. And I call that the Laura Bush hypothesis, and that's the fundamental channel through which economics, it's not the dollars that rich folks can give to their kids so much as the hugs they can. Is that making sense?
Thank you very much for this brilliant exposition. I have two questions that are somehow related. There is little doubt that the decline of the working class is one of the greatest events of the last decades. And my question is, the first question is, do you think that it will be possible with appropriate educational policies that we do not have in place in the United States to give every child a college education? Or is it so that there are a considerable amount of people who simply don't have the intellectual capacities of getting a college education, and that these people will feel themselves more and more ousted from the needs of a modern society, and therefore will be, as you say at the end of your paper, tinder for populist demagogues? So this is the first question. The second question is connected to the relation between religion and family. You insisted on the enormous advantages of religion, but you're a social scientist, I'm a philosopher. As a philosopher, of course, I'm interested in the arguments for the existence of God, and by the way, I think they're very good. But from a social point of view, simply to say we need religion in order to increase social cohesion doesn't help. It's like when Robespierre, in the height of the French Revolution, suddenly declared we need the cult of the supreme being to somehow avoid the dissolution of society. How do we get it socially? How can we bring a stronger religious conviction back in our late modern societies?
Thank you. Those are both great questions. I'll try to respond to both of them briefly, but sincerely. On the first point, I would be very careful about implying, you didn't say this, but what you said could be misunderstood as saying there are some people who are just so dumb that they can't have real jobs. And I don't think that's true, actually. I think the most important kind of jobs in the new era that we're entering are not so much coding, but caring. That is, it's not so much the job that's required is going to be caring both for younger people and for older people like me. And you don't have to be have a high mathematics ability to care for me as I get older. And those qualities, I don't say they're negatively correlated, but they're not positively correlated. So there are plenty of jobs, I think, for which people who are not now going to college. First of all, there's a lot more we could do with college educating the stock of workers we have, the stock of kids we have. But we also could do much better with valorizing, giving value to, and I don't just mean monetary value, but also monetary value, and training for the caring economy. And so so I'm optimistic. It requires policy choices. It requires making choices, but it's not like this is an impossible problem. And I'm very reluctant. I don't mean you are, but some of the language could lead it to the idea that there are going to be some dumb people that we just have to, a lot of, if I can put it this way, a lot of individualists take this view. There are some dumb people and we should just pay for them to, provide care for them. Yes?
Difficulties to adapt to the service economy.
On the second question about why is religion so valuable, actually, in the book that I'm sorry, I sound like I'm trying to advertise other books, but I wrote a book a couple of years ago called American Faith. And it's a book about religion in America. Most of it is not relevant here. American Grace. Gosh, you'd think I'd remember my names of my books. American Grace, thank you. There are a lot of stuff in it that would not, unless you happen to be interested in the sociology of religion, would not be particularly interesting. But this is, I think, interesting. That's the book in which, by social scientific standards, I proved that religious people are nicer. So the question is, what is it about religious people that are nice, that makes them nicer? Is it the theology, or is it something else? And the answer, I'm going to give you the answer without giving you all the proof. The answer is being involved in the religious community makes you nicer. If you're involved in a religious community, you're nicer, not believing in God. And I can say that a different way that will be shocking. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be shocking people. If you are an atheist who nevertheless attends church suppers all the time, and you say, well, how could that be? And the answer is spouses. So you're dragged by you're an atheist, but you're dragged to church suppers or other social activities at church by your wife. You turn out to be even nicer than a God-fearing, completely, utterly theistic, I mean an utterly believing person who sits in the pews every day and prays alone. Praying alone, that is theology alone. I know this is contrary, but this is what the facts say. Praying alone doesn't make you a nicer person. Hanging out with other religious people, even if you don't believe. Now, it's still religion. It's not just hanging out with anybody. So there's the investigation we've got to understand is what is happening in, I don't have enough knowledge about Catholic social life to know to give examples, but there's something about, I know this is true of Catholics because it's true in this very large data, something about hanging out in a religious context turns out to make you a nicer person. Over to you to figure out what that is. But it's not just theology that does it. I don't know if you may not agree with me, but that's my claim.
Okay, well, congratulations. Very good paper and very provocative answers as well. I'd like to bring the theme of urbanization. US is very urbanized. Latin America is one of the most urbanized places in the world. Over 80% of Latin America is urban. And I don't have any evidence, but my perception is that as people migrate from small, poor villages to large favelas, large, poor neighborhoods in Latin America, kids are more exposed to violence and to crime, whereas in these rural settings, they're more exposed to nature and also to more communal life. So I'd like to first ask you, have you done any research and providing any evidence in that? And the second point is about the reality that I'll be bringing all the time here, which is the Amazon, which is a very different world. We see a widening gap within Amazonian countries, within southern Brazil and the Amazon, within the Colombian Amazon and the other parts of those countries. And Marcelo and I, we've had several discussions visiting the Amazon about the role of empty churches, the impact of empty Catholic churches because of lack of priests. And that has, and again, I'm not a political scientist and I don't have any evidence on that, but my perception is that these lack of religious activities associated with the lack of priests, and that was an issue that was dealt in the synod that Pope Francis convened. That has a relationship with dismantling families in the core of the rainforest. And I don't know the statistics. I became very interested in maybe trying to see if we can develop some of these analyses in the Amazon. But the proportion of young mothers is amazing. Most young mothers, most girls are pregnant before they're 18. And most kids are raised in what you call how families without stable fathers. And that has impact in deforestation, because in order to promote sustainable conservation of the Amazon, we have to educate people on how to manage resources sustainably. And if they have less cognitive capacity, that has implications for global climate change. So I'm just making the connection between different themes there and adding sort of a little bit of complexity, and like to ask your thoughts.
I'll respond. I'll try to respond briefly. First of all, on the latter point about the empty churches, I don't know anything about. I know a little bit about the Amazon because I spent 2 weeks birding in the Amazon, and it was a wonderful experience. I probably was bad for the environment, but I was there taking lots of pictures of the incredible birds life there. So that's my extent of my knowledge of the Amazon. But if I had to bet, I'd bet that the empty churches, if the churches ever got filled, they don't so much need preaching, they need community building. Where the church works best, it's building a community of believers, not just preaching the gospel, if I can put it that way. I know that those are related, but it's your work in community building is, from my point of view, exactly the right thing to do. Lastly, and I should have said this much before, I should have confessed. I do know a fair amount about Latin America, but only because of the family. My daughter is one of America's leading Latin American historians, and especially has worked on gender and race in the Caribbean. And so all that I know about Latin America and urbanization comes from her. But the story you tell about the movement from rural areas to the favelas is exactly right. I'm speaking now in the voice. I'm transmitting my daughter's views to you. I don't want to take credit for them. They're her views. And when it was suggested that I should include something about Latin America in this paper, I was able to respond to that only because of the family. That is, I Zoomed my daughter instantly after getting the request that I say something about Latin America here. I sent her an email. I don't mean Zoom. I texted her instantly, and within 3 minutes, she wrote back. This is family obligation I'm talking about right here. Within 3 minutes, she zoomed back saying, "Dad, I'm in the middle of a meeting, but here are 3 books you ought to read." And I did. So my paper here is utterly indebted to the bonds of intergenerational family trust and obligation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would pick up only for a very short moment the question of Vittorio Hussle, the second question. I think we have to make the difference between faith and religion. That's very important. And if we are looking on the situation, for instance, in Germany or in the Benelux, and in France, perhaps also, and in Great Britain since 200 years, then we have exactly, I would say, the analysis of Charles Taylor, A Secular Age. So there's a lack of people who want to be religious. Figuriamoci the faithful, so to be silent of people who want to be Catholic. So we have a very other situation, I think, in this northwestern Europe than perhaps in the States, perhaps also in Italy, and we have to make the difference between faith and religious. So religious can be the lubricating oil for society. Faith, Catholic faith, that's quite another question, and we have to look what would be the purpose of our acting. Thank you.
I don't think I have any response to that. From a sociological point of view, but that's not the only point of view, but from a sociological point of view, I have to say religion without faith, if it includes lots of connections, does the job. I am certainly not the right person to say whether faith is the most important thing in a higher perspective. And so I have nothing to add to that conversation.
She's online. Would you mind listening to her? So, Elizabeth, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I am so sorry that I cannot be with you in person, but I have so enjoyed all of these conversations via Zoom. And I wanted to just ask any of the people who have commented on some of the changes, and especially Professor Putnam, what I haven't heard anybody talk about are issues having specifically to do with the role of women, which I think is vital in preserving the we society. One of the things that I'll be talking about tomorrow in my paper is the lived experience of women in the United States who cannot believe that their families are an aspect of the common good, or that there is a we society when it comes to child raising, because of the lack of any support for child raising in all of American policies and laws. And even more importantly, though, and deeper, the trajectory of the feminist arguments that all were arising around the same time in the 60s as some of the factors that have been already addressed in this discussion, which have led to an insistence on autonomy and equality as something that should be, is just ingrained in the fabric of how women think about themselves, that is deeply inimical to any kind of a we society. So my question in general is for anybody who has contributed a thought to this discussion so far, is that do you see any particular gender-based disparities, or do you agree or disagree with the idea that it is in particular women who have the responsibility for maintaining the value in parenting and in family bonds that we are all seem to be agreeing is so necessary to preserve the family.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. Please.
She's disappeared from our screen. Thank you very much for that, that important correction. It is certainly true in all the research that I've done. I want to be careful how I express this because I have to be sure I'm facts-based, but I think in general, women are better at we than men are. And that's deeply true in every research that I'm familiar with. Women are more, hi, there you are. I have the feeling I'm speaking now to you because you're here on the wall. I've never actually published on gender, or only a little bit on gender, but all the research I'm familiar with suggests that women are much more attuned to, but also much better at team building, paying attention to voices that have been omitted from the conversation, better at listening than men are. There's a ton of, you know this very well, there's a ton of literature on women being better at listening than men, as my daughter always reminds me. So on that score, I completely agree with the thrust of what you were saying. And conversely, a society that underplays or that doesn't just underplay, but underuses the talents of women is going to be less able to be a we society. But then there's the more specific point about childcare and so on, that is valorizing the tasks that women typically, caregiving tasks that women typically perform. And this, I think, is, and I don't know whether you agree or disagree with what I'm about to say, this is a real challenge for at least America going forward. That is to say, we're going to clearly need more caregiving, not less in the future. Overall, that's what I was saying before, overall. And women are probably better at that than men, but saying that doesn't mean it's better for my daughter to spend her next 20 years caring for me. It's better maybe for her to have to do what she does best, which is be a Latin American historian and earn enough that she can hire or pay at an adequate rate maybe some guy who's not so good at caregiving. So I'm being a little inarticulate here, but what I'm trying to say is I agree about the importance of caregiving. I agree that women are probably better at it. I reject, as probably you do too, the idea that only women can do caregiving, because I think those tasks too ought to be more fairly divided. But at some point, now or in the future, I'd be interested in hearing your views on what I've just said.
Waiting for us. Those who do not get earlier get nothing, okay? So thank you very much. It was a very intensive session, this one.